this way? Does it seem? How's that? So we might let the sound system operation. So, well, I was talking yesterday about externalist meaning. Now at the heart theory. It's two reference, the relation, and
which is supposed to be Dixon's reference framework that comes framing. The externalist theory of meaning holds that meaning is not in the mind, and the fixation of reference is not in the mind. What a word refers to depends on first social factors, and second, real world factors. And since the reference depends on those factors, obviously, in mind. This is by now the prevailing theory. It yields what's called the notion of wide content, broad content, meaning, reference, and a mode fixing broad content, which will be meaning. There's then a debate that goes on. Let's take it for granted this has been established. So if you look at the literature, you find background assumptions wisdom exists. And then there's very proceedings as to whether there's also something called narrative, which would be the internalist version, as well as a traditional conception of meaning as something that's in the head. So according to an internalist version, you know what you mean. According to an externalist version, you don't know what you mean. Because it's determined by the outside world and by future discoveries of science and societies in which you play a part. This goes along with the idea that for most people, each person has a partial and generally erroneous understanding and knowledge of their own language. And the language is what it is, even if nobody knows it. Simply say what the meaning of the word is what it is, even if nobody knows it. And typically nobody will know because that's what we on future discoveries of science. Well, this theory is, we might think to ask, what is the theory? Is a theory about something? What is this theory about? The idea is that these external factors, these so-called real-world factors, provide us with the real meaning, the real notion of meaning and reference. And then the question for us is real meaning, real notion. Well, there are two possible interpretations of this. One is that we're trying to capture the common sense notion, the notion in ordinary usage, what's called grandma's So that's one possibility. We're trying to, it's the real notion of meaning because that's grandma's notion. That's the notion that ordinary people have. The second possible interpretation is that it's the true notion. That is, it's the notion of meaning that is accurate about the world, tells the truth about the world. It's the notion of meaning that will arise in the ultimate best science about the world. Okay. So it's a true notion, part of science. And it's never been made very clear which of those two is the intended target of the approach, but probably the first. grandma's view, folk psychology, that's what the philosopher is trying to capture in the theory of meaning. Well, it doesn't seem that could be correct for one reason, one simple reason, because in ordinary language, there is no notion of reference as a relation between words and things. Therefore, there can't be any notion of broad content or narrow content or anything else. There is the notion of refer, but that is used for people, like most of the intentional language understanding, and so on. These are all referring as an action that people do. In any language I've ever heard of, certainly in English, people refer to things using words or gestures or whatever, but the gestures don't refer, and the words don't refer, except maybe very derivatively. So I can say, and in fact you can refer to things without even mentioning them. You can say that John was referring to London when he was complaining about the traffic, or when he was telling us what a wonderful performance of Richard II he saw. He didn't mention London or have any phrase indicating London, but he could perfectly well have been referring to London. We might say, sometimes we can speak of words referring, but more like incorrectly. You could say, John was using the word London to refer to Paris, let's say. Maybe half-perversely or something like that. That's certainly possible, and then we could go on to say, in John's last statement, the word London referred to Paris. Okay, now we have a relation between words and things, but it's highly derivative. The main usage, the core usage, has to do with people and what they do, just as in all the intentional vocabulary, thinking, understanding, interpreting. These are things people do. That's the way language works. I've never heard of a language that has any other character. In fact, when Frege established the subject, he had to make up new technical terms to capture what he wanted. So the technical terms, bedeutung and Sinn, which are variously translated in various languages, this one is the one that's supposed to be reference, and this one's the one that's supposed to be meaning. But he had to make up technical, and of course they are words of German, but he explicitly gave them special technical meanings because they don't have those meanings in German. And when they translate into English this reference and sense or whatever, they are technical terms. They have a technical term has whatever meaning you give to it. There's no debate about what it means. You know, if somebody defines momentum, we no longer have to debate about what it means for them. They're told us. We also have no intuitions about technical terms. You can't have any intuitions about angular momentum, let's say, or undecidability in a sense. You can talk about what it means to you or something that doesn't make any sense. It doesn't mean anything to you. It means exactly what it was stipulated to mean. So notions like reference and fixation of reference, if reference is held to be a relationship between words and things, whatever value the notion has, it can't be part of grandma's view, because she doesn't have any such notion, nor does anybody. You can understand the notion. I mean, it's an intelligible notion. You can make it up, and then comes the question whether there exists such a relationship. Does there exist a relationship between words and things, as it's claimed? Once you can define the notion, all right, but that doesn't establish the relationship. You can define all kinds of notions. You still have to show that the relationship exists. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But in any event, it cannot be that the intent of this inquiry or effort is to establish folk psychology. In fact, if it were an attempt to establish the ideas of folk psychology, one would wonder what the point is. After all, that's a topic in cultural anthropology. It's unclear what it has to do with philosophy. Just as the study of people's ordinary conceptions of the nature of the natural world is a topic in cultural anthropology, ethnoscience. And different groups of people have different interpretations of the way the world works and so on. It's a fine subject, nothing wrong with ethnoscience. It's illuminating. But it's Are you having trouble hearing? I may not need it. Can you hear me back there with that?
If you can wear that portable, it will pick up for recording purposes.
Oh, I see. We should have. That's okay.
Oh, that's fine, yes.
It's good when sure strangling itself.
Get the signal from back there. Okay. Is this working or? Is this working? Is it working now?
The portable's working for recording purposes.
I see.
The speaker's not working.
I see. Well, can you hear me in the back? Yeah. Yeah? Okay. So you want me to keep using this anyway? You don't care? I should keep using it. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, you should, please.
I should keep using it. Okay. Even if it's not working.
Up there are different
Yeah.
companies, you know.
Okay. Well, let's turn then to the second possibility. This is that this theory is an attempt to find the truth about the world. That sounds incomprehensible. I don't know what that means even. What truth about the world are we trying to discover? Maybe one can make some sense of that, but I think an explanation would at least have to be given. What aspect of science are we now investigating? I mean, if you're doing biology, you sort of understand what you're doing. What aspect of science are we investigating when we say that the right notion of meaning is broad content? Okay. That's a very obscure idea. I have no idea what it means, but at least it would have to be explained, and it hasn't been. I think the reason it hasn't been is because it's generally assumed that this is an account of the folk psychology, of the ordinary usage, Grandma's view. Let's try another one. Is this one better? Yeah? You still want me to keep this thing? Yeah, okay. You know, the real autocrats of the modern age are the television people and the photographers and so on. So anybody knows that. Well, let's imagine, let's grant that we have some understanding of this, although I don't think it's obvious that we do, but let's grant it for the sake of argument, and compare the notions wide or broad content and the notions narrow content. Suppose we have a phenomenon, some phenomenon or other, say Bert and the arthritis, and we can give an explanation for the phenomenon in terms of broad content, and we can also give an explanation in terms of narrow content. Suppose that works out. Well, then the explanation in terms of narrow content wins. It's the one that would be preferred for pure methodological reasons. One reason is that the explanation in terms of narrow content is clearly part of science. Therefore, it's naturalistic, and it therefore carries no burden of proof. Narrow content is, remember, it's a scientific question, a question of biology ultimately, to discover, if this is a child, what class of linguistic expressions get formed in the child's mind via the generative procedure. And if indeed there is a notion, if we can give an account, narrow content would involve whatever the semantic properties of this are. This is a collection of properties, say phonetic and structural and semantic properties. And if there are semantic properties, which we can think of as being instructions for use, analogously, phonetic properties are instructions to the articulatory perceptual system. If indeed there are semantic properties, that is, there is an internalist notion of meaning, a notion of narrow content, then that one, and if that notion of meaning can be used to explain the phenomena, then we don't even look at other notions like externalist ones, because this is the methodologically preferable one. One, it's part of the world, clearly. It's a notion that arises from scientific inquiry, naturalistic inquiry, with all the problems of getting the truth and so on, but it carries no burden, carries no further burden. In contrast, the notion of an externalist notion would carry a heavy burden of justification. It is not a naturalistic concept. It's some kind of, it's a concept in part of sociology, and it's also got the problem that since real world factors enter, that means that the notion of external content depends on everything in on all of science. Okay, to discover the meaning of a particular word, say water, you have to, in principle, all of science is relevant to that. So it's a highly holistic notion, so holistic that it's completely comprehensive, includes everything. A concept that, in order to be fixed, requires knowledge of everything is not a naturalistic concept in any serious sense. Insofar as social factors are involved, we're really pretty much at sea. There's no indication of how social factors are delimited, what are the right communities, and so on. So it's not, if it's a naturalistic concept at all, it's a very high order one, maybe like a concept of sociology or something like that. And a concept of biology always wins if it is equally explanatory. Furthermore, so on the one hand, the internalist notion has no burden, and the externalist one has a burden. Secondly, there's no doubt that the internalist notion is far simpler. I mean, the externalist notion is extraordinarily complex. It involves any kind of social interaction that might be involved in a person's deciding to use a word one or another way, and any inquiry into the world that might tell us the truth about what the word actually refers to. We're now granting that we can make some sense of this idea. Thirdly, the internalist notion appears to be a prerequisite for the externalist one. Now that's worth thinking about for a minute. The question is, can you even present the externalist notion, the notion of wide content, without presupposing an internalist notion? Okay. First, if the answer is that you can't, then surely if the internalist notion alone suffices to provide a description, you won't go on to the externalist one for that reason alone. Well, is that the case? Let's take, say, Bert and the arthritis again. And remember the way the situation was set up. Bert goes to the doctor and says he has arthritis in his ankle and his thigh, and the doctor explains to him that arthritis is just used for joints, and he doesn't have it in his ankle because he has a sprained ankle. But Bert went to the doctor with some kind of concept in mind. He had a word, arthritis, which had some semantic features, according to Tyler Burge, the wrong ones, okay, whatever that means. But in any event, he had some semantic features. He didn't go to the doctor with the word arthritis. He didn't go to the doctor and say, I have glub, some made-up word, in my thigh. He went and said, I had arthritis in my thigh, and arthritis had a specific meaning. The doctor had to correct him because he had semantic features. If he didn't have any semantic features, the doctor couldn't have corrected it. Same in the case of Hilary Putnam and Elm and Beach. elm and beech weren't just nonsense syllables for Putnam. In that case, he wouldn't have known how to go to an expert. Elm and beech meant, you know, big tree or something. So they had some features. And in fact, if you look through the literature, you'll discover that in all the cases, the discussion begins, it's a descriptive account of how meaning is fixed. It starts by the assumption that there's some initial array of semantic features that the terms have, maybe the wrong ones according to this theory. Well, is that eliminable? Could you...
Do you have anything in your mind if you go to the doctor and say, well, I'm not feeling well?
Well, if you go to the doctor and say, I'm not feeling well, the doctor doesn't correct you. See, this is a question of how you fix the meaning of a term. The idea here always is to show that the actual meaning of the terms we use, we might not know. We might be wrong about, because the actual meaning is determined by experts and you know, the reality of the world. If you go to the doctor and say, I'm not feeling well, he doesn't correct you. It's true, you're not feeling well. You used the terms exactly accurately. You didn't have anything more to say about it, but there's no meaning to be corrected. So you don't engage. If you go to the doctor and you say, I'm not feeling well, you don't engage in a discussion about the meanings of words. On the other hand, if you go to the doctor and say, I have arthritis in my thigh, according to this story, the doctor, you do enter into a discussion about the meanings of words. The doctor tells you didn't understand the word arthritis. Okay. So sure, we can not have anything in mind, but that's, yeah.
The child's mind is a command that orders stop the meaning function and go to the real world function.
Sorry, I didn't know.
It can be that in the child's mind there is a command.
A comment?
A command that orders stop the meaning function and go to real world function.
So the child might just block the semantic features. Block the semantic features and go straight to the real world.
In order to get a meaning.
Well, the question is whether that's conceivable. Is it possible to have a notion of I language in which expressions will lack semantic features altogether, and then you turn to the world or to society to fill in the semantic features? It's not so simple to construct such an idea. If you have no semantic features at all, how do you approach the problem of adding semantic features? How do you do that if you have no semantic features at all? Do you have the concept of semantic features? I mean, is it that you've got a concept of semantic features but you never fill them in? Well, if you do, there has to be some structure to that concept. There have to be certain things that are possible semantic features and others that are not possible semantic features. So in order to build up, this is a theoretically possible account. It just seems to me hopelessly unpersuasive. You'd have to assume that in universal grammar, in the child's mind, there is some characterization of the semantic features. Okay? So in the child's mind, there is some characterization of the class of possible semantic features, just as there must be a characterization of the class of phonetic features. If there's no such classification, if there's no initial categorization of that type, you'll never pick up any of them, no matter what evidence you use. Okay, that's just, you know, ordinary logic. Unless there's enough structure to tell you what counts as a semantic feature, you'll never find any of them. So we have to assume that the child has the notion of semantic feature, has some theory of semantic features in the mind, in some form or other, but doesn't use it. Okay. Rather, the child develops a concept of language which never uses those features, and then turns to others in some fashion, or turns to the actual world, say to the future discoveries of science, to fill in the features. I don't even know what this means. I mean, obviously the child doesn't turn to the future discovery of science to fill in the features. When you say that the child turns to others to fill in the features, how is that any different from saying the child uses the data to add features to the items in the lexicon? That seems just a way of restating the internalist picture. I mean, let's try the same thing on the phonetic side. Suppose somebody came along and said, look, I have a new theory of acquisition of the sound structure of language. The child, of course, has a theory of universal phonetics, has some kind of characterization of the possible sound features, but the child doesn't use them. The child just creates a lexical item without any phonetic features, but all the other features, and then turns to the world, let's say to what other people are doing, to add the phonetic features. That doesn't seem to be any different than saying the child uses the data to build up lexical items that have phonetic and semantic features. It's a funny way of saying that simple thing. There seems no way, as far as I can see, of avoiding an internalist notion in constructing the concept of external content, any more than there would be a way of developing some corresponding phonological conception. You might try to think about it and see if you can imagine a way in which the notion externalist content, wide content, can even be intelligibly described without presupposing that an operation of this kind has taken place. That is, that the child has looked at data and constructed items which include various properties, including semantic properties. Now, it would be intelligible to say the child has the wrong semantic properties, just as it would be intelligible to say the child has the wrong phonetic properties. I don't think, I mean, when I say intelligible, I don't think it's the right view. I don't think it makes any sense. But you can, at least it's coherent. But such a view is always based on a prior internalist account, based on narrow content, and according to this view, the wrong narrow content. If that's, I should say, let's take an analogous argument. I mentioned this is a kind of problem that arises all the time. Notice that if this is correct, if the internalist account is a prerequisite for the externalist one, if it's simpler, which is obvious, if it's naturalistic, whereas the other is not, which is also obvious, then going back to my original statement, if you can give a naturalistic, an internalist account, it wins for those reasons. Now, in the case of, say, Bert and the arthritis, there's a perfectly fine internalist account. Bert went to the doctor with his own lexical item, arthritis, maybe pronounced it differently, maybe said arthritis. The doctor said, here's the way we use the word, and I'm a big shot, so you ought to use it the way I use it. And Bert could decide, okay, I'll use it the doctor's way. That means Bert would then introduce some modifications in his I language. And since this is a very peripheral part of the I language, you know, it's not like the system of anaphora or something which you can't tamper with. This is a part of the, Bert could simply decide, in effect, to drop this linguistic expression, to throw that word out of his I language, and introduce a new word. We're picking up new words all the time, you know. And he'd say, okay, I'll pick up a new word which pronounces arthritis. He used to pronounce it with an I over here, you know, phonetically this. Now he'll pronounce it with this. And this new word will have a different phonology, and it'll have a different semantics. It'll now refer to, you know, diseases of the joints. That's just like learning a new word. I mean, we know that people can learn new words, you know. So in fact, Bert, and you don't have to go beyond narrow content and I language to account for learning new words. It means simply you've added to your lexicon a new connection, a new collection of features. You do that all the time, all through your life. You know. And maybe you throw out some old word. You're not going to use it anymore. Well, that's a completely and then we ask, why did Bert do it? Well, you know, you go into authority structures or whatever. That's a completely internalist account of that interaction. And no notion of broad content, nothing else, and it's completely accurate. It doesn't lose anything. In fact, it's probably the best account you can think of that, of what happened. Same in the case of elm and beech. If I go to my Italian gardener, give him the Latin name, and he tells me which is the elm and which is the beech, I can decide to amplify my, or to make, actually add, to amplify my lexicon, to introduce new items into my lexicon, which include the features that he told me about. I don't have to get into the absurdity of thinking that he's part of my linguistic community, which he certainly isn't, because he's a monolingual Italian. But it's a completely internalist account. It appeals to nothing more than ordinary acquisition of vocabulary items through experience. In this case, through experience plus decision. But that doesn't change anything. So there is a perfectly fine, and if you run through the literature, you'll find, I think, that in every case of alleged social factors and meaning, there's a perfectly straightforward internalist account that makes use of the social factors, of course, but doesn't make use of any notion of broad content. Well, since the notion of broad content requires narrow content as a prerequisite, presupposes narrow content, is far more complex, and is non-naturalistic, there's no reason to introduce it, at least for social factors. So it would seem. So at least that aspect of the externalist theory, this aspect here, seems to be dismissible. We don't need it. That's the aspect that had to do with common language, common public language. And that's just as well, because as I said, that's an incoherent notion anyhow. So anything that appealed to it is, we're happy to get rid of. I was starting to say before, there are analogous arguments in other areas. Take, say, Davidson's story about constructing a passing theory. So we have a communication situation. We have an interpreter. And the interpreter hears Mary over here and listens to Mary's sentences. And the interpreter, Peter, constructs a passing theory using any information at all to try to figure out what Mary's saying. Okay, and the passing theory could be anything. You could use knowledge about Mary's background, anything that might be relevant. And then this passing theory looks at that evidence and comes out with some interpretation. That's the story. Well, the question that might be asked is there, let's look at the question of prerequisites. Does this approach presuppose the existence of a parser, let's say? A parser is a device that takes in data, a parser, and gives some kind of structural account of it. Okay. The structural account that it gives is, of course, based on whatever I language is internal to the parser. So, for example, if I hear you speaking, one of the things that I do is assign a phonetic representation and a division into words and into phrases and so on and so forth, and also assign meanings and so on. I do it in terms of my I language. Of course, that's not the only thing I do, since first I have to overcome the problem that your I language is different from mine. So I also have to work out this class of modifications which will allow me to interpret your expressions as some parallel expressions of mine. But the question is whether the Davidsonian theory that you construct a passing theory can be even described, can be even presented coherently without assuming that somewhere along the line a parser enters into the picture, something that assigns structure to utterances on the basis of a person's I language. Well, I won't go into that, but try it. Try to construct a theory of the interpreter that doesn't presuppose that at some stage in the process you're actually assigning structure to utterances in terms of your own I language. I think it's impossible to do that. You sort of leave it as an exercise to the reader. See if you can construct an account. Davidson doesn't tell you how this happens, but see if you can construct an account of the interpreter that doesn't introduce this notion at some point in the along the line. I don't think that that's possible. An analogous question also arises constantly in the case of the standard picture of fixation of I language. So take this picture. This picture is always, if presented accurately, is presented in an idealized form. You assume that the data is homogeneous. Okay, so it's not half Italian and half English, let's say. Or it doesn't involve contradictory information, you know, like contradictory phonetics, let's say. Typically, one says that we're studying the acquisition of language in an idealized, homogeneous speech community, where everybody speaks exactly the same way, and they pronounce things the same way, and they have the same meanings and the same structures and so on. And we ask, what I language would be produced in a child's mind in such a community? Okay, that's what this is really a description of. Well, a very common critique is that this is an illegitimate idealization because the real world doesn't have homogeneous communities, which is perfectly true. It doesn't. There's no such thing as a homogeneous community. And there are certainly, if the critique that something's an illegitimate idealization, of course, has to be taken seriously. There are illegitimate idealizations. So, for example, it can be argued, and I think correctly, that classical economics involves an illegitimate idealization in that it studies market systems without looking at questions of power. That's a critique. You know, you got to ask, is it right or wrong? I think it's probably right. The question is whether in this case it's an illegitimate idealization. And here we turn again to the matter of presupposition and prerequisites. That is there a possible account of acquisition of language in real-world heterogeneous situations that doesn't presuppose this account? Well, just think what such an account would have to be. First, we ask question number one. Suppose somebody says, I think this is an illegitimate idealization, then my question to him would be this. One, is it possible for a child to learn a language in a homogeneous situation? Is that a possibility? Okay. In other words, is it necessary for language learning that you hear conflicting, incoherent data? Is that a necessary feature of language learning, that the data that you hear contradict other data? Well, that's absurd. I mean, obviously, it's not a prerequisite for language learning that you hear conflicting data. It's not a prerequisite for learning a language that you hear both Italian and English intermingled, let's say. I don't think anybody would claim that. Well, if so, it is certainly possible for a child to learn language if the data is homogeneous, consistent, in other words. It's possible to learn language from consistent data. If it is possible, then there's got to be some property that the child has in his mind, call it the property P, which enables the child to learn language in a homogeneous situation, or would enable the child to learn language in a homogeneous situation if it existed. So we've now established that there is such a property in the mind. Well, next question is, does language learning in the normal situation make use of P? P plus other things. You know, suppose you are faced in a real-world situation with conflicting data. Does the child make use of the property P, which we see must be there, or does it just not use it at all? Well, there's two possibilities. Either it makes use of P plus other techniques to get around the fact that the data is conflicting, in which case P is a prerequisite for the complex. The idealized model is a prerequisite for the complex situation. Or else one would have to argue that no, the child doesn't use P. In other words, human beings have this funny property in their heads that would enable them to learn language in a homogeneous situation, but they never use it. Okay, just like sort of sitting there. Complex property, UG and so on, is there in the brain, but it's never put to use. In actual situations, they do something else, always. Well, you know, that's not a physical impossibility. I mean, an organism might have some complex capacity that it never uses, but it's pretty outlandish. And if you think that this is an illegitimate idealization, you're committed to one of those two views. Either that it's impossible to learn language unless the data is conflicting, or else that a child has the capacity to learn language under such a situation, but it's never been used in the history of the human species. Well, either of those two assumptions is too ridiculous to take seriously, from which it follows that not only is the idealization legitimate, but it's presupposed in all actual work. Now, a lot of questions have come up about sociolinguistics a couple of times. This is a typical case. Sociolinguistics studies things like the acquisition of language in non-homogeneous situations. And often sociolinguists claim that they reject the idealizations of the linguist. But I think it's clear that they don't reject them unless they want to commit themselves to one of these two absurd ideas. I mean, unless they want to commit themselves to one or the other of these absurd ideas, they presuppose the linguist's conceptions tacitly. And then that tells you how you should do the work, namely in the reasonable way. You should ask how the property P, the property that enables you to use language, to learn language in a homogeneous situation, is used in accord with alongside of other talents and other capacities to deal with the real world situation. Same in the case of the interpreter. You'll ask how the parser, which is based on the operation that assigns structures based on the I language, how is that used in more complex situations to yield interpretations? The argument over there is pretty much the same, except for one difference. The part that's the same says, how would, if you're interested in external content, you would ask how internal content is used to establish external content. Same reasons, it's a prerequisite, so how do you use it? The difference is that in these two cases, it's clear that you're talking about at least something. I mean, interpretation does go on. Language learning under situations of conflict does go on, but it's not at all clear that establishment of external content goes on. However, if it does, if people actually are picking up vocabulary items and modifying them and so on the basis of the real world and social factors, then an account of that will have to presuppose and build upon the notion of narrow content in any event. So the debate as to whether there is narrow content makes no sense. It's being presupposed. It's like a debate in sociolinguistics about whether there exists, whether the linguist's concept even exists. Well, they have to because they're presupposing them, unless they want to commit themselves to absurdity. This type of argument applies over and over again. It's worth thinking about it, and I think it's quite accurate. Well, in this case, we appear to have an internalist account, purely internalist account of the social interactions, which makes no appeal to things like common language or anything else. That account is preferable on all grounds, and indeed seems to be presupposed in the externalist account. So that would seem to settle that issue. There's a kind of an epistemological priority to the internalist notion. You have to have it before you build up to the externalist one. Just as there's an epistemological priority to the notion of acquisition of language in homogeneous speech communities. You need it in order to build up to the higher notion. And probably, though it's not certain, the same is true about parsers and interpreters. If so, it seems that we are not forced to move to the study of everything in order to deal with the notion of meaning. At least with regard to social factors, it's perfectly possible to keep to a completely internalist account. Now, I'll come back to the harder question of real-world factors in a minute. I think it is harder, more puzzling in certain ways. But let me make it clear what I'm not saying. I'm not suggesting that naturalistic accounts are a possible alternative to the standard externalist accounts. I'm not saying that. Rather, I think that the externalist accounts cannot be seriously considered. They can't be seriously entertained, at least with regard to social factors, because there is a naturalistic account, and secondly, because the basis for the externalist account, the notion of common public language or community or whatever, has not been clarified. So it's hand-waving. It's hand-waving and it's unnecessary. So it's not that the naturalistic account is an alternative that we can place alongside the standard theories. Rather, it's the only theory. The standard ones just don't deserve being considered, at least with regard to social factors. Let me repeat something I said before. I'm also not suggesting that we use the concept idiolect instead of language or dialect in the sense of common language. An idiolect in all this literature, the term idiolect is used to refer to the particular system, the particular speech, the grammar or the set of rules or something for a particular person in particular situations, particular style of speech for a particular person. And that notion is also not of much use. It's not an I language. It's not an I language because it was developed in the person's head in the actual world. And the actual world is one of heterogeneous speech communities, which involve conflicting data and so on and so forth. So what has gotten into your head is some horrible mess based on the property P, that is, the property that allows you to select an I language under homogeneous conditions, plus whatever historical accidents and accidents of personal history and whatever have given this thing in your head. I mean, there's something there, but it's certainly not an I language. And the thing that's there is as of much interest to science as the flight of a feather on a windy day or something. Just some mess, not worth looking at. What you want to look at if you want to understand things, including what's going on in the real world, is what is called the idealized concept, the concept of I language as it would arise under homogeneous conditions. And the notion idealized, as I think I mentioned before, can be misleading. Idealized means real in the sciences. Idealization carries you to reality, to the elements out of which the real complexity is constituted. That's what idealization's for. If idealization is, you can be mistaken. Maybe it's an illegitimate idealization. But if you carried out idealization correctly, you're not dealing with an ideal world, you're dealing with the real world. The reality of the world is those hidden truths that we can only discover by idealization. That is, by throwing away complexity that's messing up the situation. That's, in a way, the major insight of the Galilean revolution. Galileo, for example, was criticized for studying things like balls rolling down inclined planes. Who cares about balls rolling down inclined planes? That doesn't happen. What happens is balls roll down mountainsides and so on. And he had to make an effort, a propaganda effort, to convince people that if you wanted to understand the real world, you had to look at highly idealized situations. Balls rolling down frictionless planes, something which can't even exist physically. And it's only after that intellectual wrench has been made that you enter the world of natural science. That wrench hasn't been made in most fields. So, especially in these fields, it's still pre-scientific in the sense that the understanding that to get at reality, you have to idealize is considered quite controversial in the study of humans. And that's a sign of their primitiveness. Another sign. Well, okay, so much for the social factors. What about the real world factors? That's a tricky issue. And there's been a lot of sophisticated work on it. I'll give a couple of cases. Again, we have to ask the same question. When we look at the real world factors, are we trying to capture grandma's view or the true theory? And we have the same problems. If we're trying to capture grandma's view, she doesn't have any view about reference, so therefore she can't have a view about real world factors. If we're trying to develop the true theory of reference, it's unclear what we're doing. It's unclear what the topic of study is, what the empirical conditions of this inquiry are. It's not like trying to explain the truth about perception or something. Well, that fact, maybe we can learn something by looking at maybe we can clarify this issue by looking at the matter of perception. Because in fact, these arguments have been applied not just to language, but to psychology generally. That is, it's commonly believed that all of psychology, not just language, has to be externalist, okay? Has to deal with real-world factors. We're now dropping the social factors. and looking just at the real world factors, and it is widely argued and widely assumed that all of psychology, not just the language part, is crucially wedded to real world factors. So take perceptual psychology, say vision. A common view today, applying the same externalist thinking, is that the psychologist studying vision must take into account the real nature of the things being seen. Okay, and the argument goes kind of like this: if we have the sentence "John sees a tree," okay, and that's what's being studied in the study of vision, the fact that John sees a tree, or something simpler like, say, a cube in motion or something. See is what's called a success word. You don't see something unless it's really there. If it's not really there, and you may think you see it, but you have an illusion. Okay. This is not so obvious, but it's claimed that in normal language, and there's at least something to it, see is a success word. You can't say, I saw a tree, if there wasn't a tree there. You may have thought you saw a tree, but you didn't see the tree. That's what an illusion is, when you think you see something, but it isn't there. Well, since see is a success term, and visual psychology is studying seeing, then it's got to be externalist. It has to take account of the thing that is being seen and its nature. Now, for internalist psychology, in contrast, that's the internalist theory of perception is a study of what goes on between the retina and the brain. Doesn't matter what's out there, okay? Internalist psychology asks what happens when a signal hits the retina and gets interpreted in the brain, whatever caused the signal to hit the retina. But externalist psychology must look at what caused the thing that hit the retina, because he didn't really see the tree unless it was there. For example, if somebody stimulated your retina, if there was a way of stimulating the retina with the same signals that are provided, say, by a cube rotating in space, then you would have in your head exactly the picture that you get when you see a cube rotating in space, but you wouldn't have seen it because there was no cube rotating in space. Okay, it was just some mad scientist stimulating your retina. Okay, so if we're studying, so an externalist theory of perception would require and insist, in fact, that psychology must be the study of the relation between things and percepts, whereas an internalist theory of perception says psychology is the study of the relation between retinal images and percepts. Now notice that an internalist psychology has no problem with the fact that see is a success word. It just says, I'm not studying seeing. Seeing is something that people do. I'm studying the way in which they do it. I'm studying the mechanisms that enter into what people do in the real world. And those mechanisms lie between the retina and the brain. And then when I want to talk about, how people find their way in the world, I'm going to add all sorts of other stuff. But I'm studying this part of the process, that's psychology. Well, it's commonly argued, it's argued particularly by Tyler Burge again, who's had a series of articles, as have others, Martin Davies, who expected to be here but couldn't make it, and others have argued that actual psychology, actual visual psychology, is externalist. So they're concerned, they're interested particularly in work in the David Marr school. David Marr was a neurophysiologist who pretty much opened up large parts of the contemporary theory of vision by developing models of the visual process that carry it from stimuli up till not quite percepts, but at least sort of partial images of percepts. And these models had neurophysiological reality and some success in explanation, and they set off a big study. It's one of the main parts of the theory of vision. So Burge and Davies and others have argued that, in fact, if you look at the work in the Marr school, it is externalist. Therefore, psychology is externalist, as it ought to be, and therefore the study of language ought to be externalist too. But this is just a misinterpretation of the work. And you can see that very clearly if you look at the experiments. The experiments don't involve cubes rotating in space. They involve tachistoscopic images. So, you know, the standard experiment would be you got a tachistoscope in which there's a bunch of points of light. And the question is, what different arrays of points of light will lead to a person seeing a cube rotating in space? And there's all kind of theories about that. Turns out that if you have 4 points of light and you give them, and I forget how many, I think 3 successive presentations, that determines a rigid object rotating in space. Your mind does all the rest of the work. It just takes the successive points and forces an interpretation of a rigid object. There's some kind of rigidity principle in your head that says, however limited the stimulation, and it can be very limited, interpret it as a rigid object moving in space, not as some other thing. That's in fact one of the big discoveries. But the discovery was not made by having people look at objects rotating in space. It was made by points of light flashing on a tachistoscope, because it was in fact only interested in the relation between the retinal image and the brain. People have been misled by the fact that in the kind of informal discussion where there's efforts to motivate what they're doing, there's a lot of talk about functional utility and evolution and, you know, how we might have gotten this way and so on. And of course, all of that talk is externalist. Talks about how people, you know, function in the world. But when you get to the actual experimental work, it's all completely internalist, and as far as I can see, it has to be. There's no way to do externalist psychology. Externalist psychology would be a study of everything. You know, it would have to include physics and chemistry and everything else. That's not a topic. You know, that's like, why do things happen again? So there's no way to do externalist psychology, and in fact, nobody does it. They do internalist psychology. They may describe it in ways that mislead people, maybe even mislead themselves, but there's no possibility of doing it. Now, are things different when we turn to the special branch of psychology that studies language? Well, let's have a look at the arguments. Notice again before proceeding that if there is an internalist account of perceiving a cube rotating in space, as there is, then we don't look for an externalist account, because the internalist account carries no burden of proof. It's strictly part of science. It's obviously far simpler, doesn't require, you know, the study of trees, let's say, and it's a prerequisite again. You can't develop the externalist account without some account of what happens between the retina and the eye. I mean, even if you were interested in studying the relationship between trees and percepts, somewhere along the way you'd have to study what goes on between the retina and the percepts. So the internalist account is surely a prerequisite, I mean, obviously in this case. Therefore, it wins, and since it works anyway, there's no further interest in externalist psychology. Exactly the same as in the social factors aspect of this. Well, let's turn to the, yeah.
Why did you call it perception or vision?
Why call it perception?
Why not only research of brain processes?
Yeah, you can call it. That's what it actually is. I mean, what's called visual psychology or psychology of perception is the study of brain processes. I mean, it's not the study of everything. You know. So, for example, if you have a real perception and an illusion, you'll give the same account of them. As far as psychology is concerned, I mean, you want to know why the Necker cube provides an illusion. But, you know, that's an internalist account. What else could it be? So, for example, a psychologist studying visual perception is not going to carry out an inquiry into the nature of trees, because people see trees. Same across the board. Well, let's take a look at the special branch of psychology that studies language and ask whether there's any more sense to an insistence on real-world factors in reference and meaning in this case. Here the arguments, again, go back largely to Putnam and Kripke in that same collection of articles that I mentioned, which about 20 years ago really set the field on a new course. And incidentally, they have a lot of very, not only well argued, but very useful material in them. They were quite important, although I don't agree with these particular conclusions. The standard argument, goes back to Putnam, is what's called the twin earth argument. I mean, that's like the paradigm around which the discussion proceeds. Putnam suggests the following. He says, think of the following thought experiment. Okay, we on Earth have a word water. Let's pick a person who he calls Oscar. On Earth has a word water, and water refers to a particular thing which scientists have told us is H2O. Okay, so the word water refers to H2O. Okay, and that's a fact about our language. Scientists told us that. Okay, that's the real world factor. Now imagine another universe, which he calls twin Earth. It's not someplace far away, but another universe, another, in which there's a duplicate of Oscar, doppelganger, a molecule by molecule replica of Oscar. Call him twin Oscar. Since he's exactly the same as Oscar, he's also going to have a word water, okay? Because his brain and everything about him is the same as Oscar. But suppose that in that universe, there is no H2O. There's another thing, let's say, with the chemical composition XYZ, whatever it may be, which happens to look exactly like water, but is a different chemical composition. And that's what twin Oscar is referring to. Okay, so twin Oscar's word water refers to XYZ, and our word water refers to H2O. Okay, so it therefore follows that meaning isn't in the head, because Oscar and twin Oscar have the same thing in the head, exactly the same thing in the head by assumption. So whatever if what fixes meaning is in the head, what fixes reference is something that's in the head, they would have to have the same reference, but they don't, because the words refer to different things. Okay, so we have therefore established that meaning isn't in the head. That's the paradigm argument. Okay. Well, is it really convincing? One thing that's, first of all, notice that it's based on, it's an exploration. Notice what the thought experiment is. It's exploring our notion of the reference of words. It's saying, under these conditions, we would say that the word water for Oscar refers to H2O, and the word water for twin Oscar refers to XYZ. That's what you're supposed to be persuaded of. To be persuaded of that, you explore your own intuitions about what words refer to, and you discover that your intuitions have this property. That's the argument, right? Like, it's not an empirical inquiry into something. It's an introspective inquiry into your own intuitions about the word refer that holds between words and things. Okay. Well, point number one is that we have no such intuitions. We can't have any intuitions because the concept refer holding between words and things is a technical invented concept. I mean, if somebody explains it to you, you can understand it, but it's not a concept that you have intuitions about, any more than you have intuitions about, say, undecidability in the technical sense. If you're studying metamathematics and you get the undecidability proofs and you start using your intuitions about the word undecidability, you better pick up another field, because you're not supposed to use those intuitions. Undecidability means whatever that guy standing up there says it means, okay? And you have no intuitions about it as a matter of logic. Similarly, if refer as a relationship between words and things is not part of ordinary usage of language, you can't have any intuitions about it. And as far as I can see, it's not part of ordinary usage. There is a word refer, but that has to do with what people do. So problem number one is you can't have any such intuitions. Well, that means it's not that people don't make judgments. In fact, everybody in the philosophical literature has made the same judgment, namely that water refers to H2O for Oscar and it refers to XYZ for twin Oscar. So they're doing something, but it must be illegitimately bringing in intuitions about the use of the word refer as something that people do to a situation where it's inapplicable. Notice the issue is not whether Oscar is, suppose we use the actual word refer. So in fact, Oscar is referring to H2O and twin Oscar is referring to XYZ. Well, that is correct, but that doesn't get you anywhere. Because if twin Oscar landed on Earth and he pointed to this, he would now be calling it water. It says, I want a glass of water. He would now be referring to H2O, and there's no paradox, no problem. Yeah, he's referring to XYZ up there, and he's referring to H2O down here. So that's no problem. I mean, the ordinary use of the word refer doesn't get us into any problems at all. We would say, in fact, up on twin Earth, Oscar was referring to XYZ because that's the stuff they have up there. When he comes down here and asks for a glass of water, he's referring to H2O because that's what we have down here. Nothing problematic about it. No real world factors in meaning. In fact, nothing. The argument only has some bite. It only goes through. You know, it only shows that meaning isn't in the head, the dramatic conclusion, if you're talking about the relation between words and things. Because see, under this story, if you accept the externalist story, when twin Oscar comes down to Earth and points to this and says it's water, he's wrong. Because water, for him, refers to XYZ. And this is H2O. Okay. That's the intuition you're supposed to have. Well, that intuition certainly doesn't refer to the word referring, because there's no doubt that he's referring to H2O when he comes here. So the intuition can only relate to the word refer, holding between words and things, but you can't have any intuitions about that. So we seem to be in an impasse. And it seems that the argument collapses. And whatever conclusions people are drawing must be some illegitimate interaction between a technical term and an actual term about which they do have intuitions, but the wrong ones in this case. It's incidentally been noted. Let's say, in fact, that twin Oscar. Let's just see where our intuitions go on this. Suppose twin Oscar comes down to Earth, okay, and he sees this, and right next to it he sees some, carbonated drink that happens to be something else. Let's say, I don't know if they have it around here, but in the United States there's something called Sprite, which looks exactly like water, but is something else. Okay, it's made that way so you'll pay money for it instead of just drinking a glass of water. So suppose there's a glass of Sprite over here and a glass of water over here, and Oscar comes down to Earth and he points to the glass of water and says, I'd like a drink of water, and he points to the glass of Sprite and says, I'd like a drink of water. Well, in the first case, he's referring correctly. He's not making a mistake. But I think in the second case, he is making a mistake. That if he comes down and points to the Sprite and says, it's a glass of water, he's making a mistake. If he points to the H2O and he says, I want a glass of water, at least my intuition is he's not making a mistake. I think it's a crucial difference between those two cases. On this account, he's making the same mistake in both cases, because water for him means XYZ. So it doesn't mean H2O and it doesn't mean Sprite. But that's highly counterintuitive. Let's proceed further. Suppose that twin Oscar is a kind of Frankenstein's monster, meaning somebody created him. Somebody created him this instant to be a molecule by molecule duplicate of Oscar. Well, now twin Oscar's had no experience at all. He was just created. It is not the case that his word water refers to XYZ, because there has been no XYZ in his environment. He had no environment. So therefore, if twin Oscar now says water, he's not referring to anything. Okay. If he comes to Earth and points to this and says, I'd like a glass of water, it's just incomprehensible. He's not referring to anything. There's no reference. That's what the conclusion we're led to. Suppose, in fact, that since we're playing games with thought experiments, Suppose there's a law of nature, not yet discovered, which works like this. Every second, each person on Earth is replaced by a duplicate from outer space who's transported over here, an precise duplicate, and then that person, continues the life until the next second when he's replaced by somebody else. So we're constantly being replaced by duplicates, okay? We would never know it, of course, because each duplicate is exactly like us. So it's just some law of nature. You can imagine a world in which that happens. Just now, in that world, nobody would ever be referring. Right? Life would go on exactly as it goes on for us, but nobody would ever be referring to anything, right? Even though life goes on exactly as it does for us. And the reason they'd never be referring to anything is they've never had any experience at all, so they can't, their words don't have reference. Well, I'll leave it to you to proceed, but make up other cases. But it seems to me that when you get into absurdities of this kind, and you very quickly get into them, you quickly look back to see what went wrong, And I think what went wrong is the attempt to have intuitions about something we can't have intuitions about, namely an invented technical term. We can't have intuitions about an invented technical term. And when we therefore try to have intuitions, we've got to go astray. And the intuitions are going to lead all over the place and into crazy paradoxes and so on and so forth. And I think that's exactly what's happened in the Twin Earth case. Now, it's interesting that Putnam picked the word water here. Why did he pick the word water? There are a lot of other words he could have picked. For example, he could have picked, as I think I've mentioned, he could have picked, say, earth, air, or fire. Those are worth putting in a category for familiar reason. They were traditionally, go back far enough, they were held to be the constituents of the universe: earth, air, fire, and water. And for the people who were speaking, of course they weren't talking English, but some counterpart to them, the people who were speaking those languages regarded all of these on a par. So how come Putnam didn't use the word air or fire for Oscar? Well, answer's obvious. There's nothing like H2O, that characterizes air. In fact, there isn't any such thing as air. There's nothing that characterizes fire. Notice we have no problem referring to fire, okay? Like there can be a fire burning in my fireplace, and I can refer to the fire just as easily as I can refer to a glass of water. I can refer to the earth, I can refer to the air, say the air is polluted today. There's no problem in referring to these things. It's just that science doesn't have any concept that's close to them. But does the fact that science has a concept that's close to water, is that of any relevance? Well, it's not obvious why. I mean, what relevance is it to our speech that there's a notion in the sciences that's not too far from what we call water? I mean, after all, it isn't the same. Like this stuff obviously isn't H2O. In fact, scientists have now discovered that if you have pure water, no impurities, it's not H2O either. It's a mixture of H2O and D2O, deuterium oxide, with a so-called heavy water. And it's a mixture, I think, in the proportions of about 6,000 to 1 or something like that. So according to this story, what Oscar is, since the reference of Oscar's term water is what scientists tell us water is, okay? It's the real world truth is what determines the reference. Then in fact, Oscar wasn't referring to H2O at all. He was referring to a mixture of H2O and D2O in the proportions of, I don't know, whatever they are, 6,000 to 1 or something like that. That's what he was referring to. And in fact, if in some other universe you have a different mixture, let's say the proportions are, 200 to 53, then Oscar was referring to a different thing. Notice this is all totally sub-perceptual. I mean, there's absolutely no way of telling the difference between water and heavy water. I mean, except by, sophisticated experiments and so on. But what Oscar is referring to, according to this story, depends on the proportions of deuterium oxide in the samples of water in his universe, which again is, you know, a highly crazy result, and can, if you push it further, will lead you to further complexity. The question is, to get back to where I was, why care what scientists tell us about the thing that they call water? I mean, scientists have a thing that they call heavy water, namely D2O. Does that affect my usage of the word water? No, it's just a homonym, you know. I mean, it happens when you do science, you usually use words from natural language, because it's too much trouble to make up words all the time. So you use familiar words from natural language, you give them a different meaning, you know. So people use the word momentum, but they give it whatever meaning they want. We use the word, say, empty category principle, and we give it whatever meaning we want, you know. Pick the words, but the fact that linguists use empty category principle to mean a certain thing doesn't influence the word empty in the meaning of the word empty in ordinary language, obviously. And similarly, the fact that physicists use the word water to distinguish, say, heavy water from what they in fact call light water, H2O. H2O is light water. The fact that they distinguish light water and heavy water has no implications whatsoever for what the word water means in English or for Oscar. Putnam selected water because he's really interested in the question of intelligibility in science. You know, how can we understand scientists from 500 years ago unless we assume that they were referring to the same thing that we're referring to? Like how can we even understand them? So therefore it must be that they were referring to what we have discovered to be water, or what some future scientist will discover when he finds that we're wrong. But that's just the wrong theory of intelligibility, for reasons I mentioned earlier. There's no more there's no more relevance to the term water in this thought experiment than earth, air, or fire. If you run it through for them, there's nothing. Now, the importance of this is that water is what's called a natural kind term. And the theory of reference, the externalist theory of reference that's being built up both by Kripke and Putnam originally and by everyone else, has to do with natural kind terms and with proper names, like, say, Oscar. The purpose of the theory is to explain the reference and meaning of basically names, proper names for, say, people or cities, and natural kind terms, which are also names. They're supposed to be names of the basic constituents of the universe. Natural kinds means kinds of nature. But the problem is that language doesn't have natural kind terms. The terms of language don't pick out the constituents of nature, except by the most amazing accident. You know, that's not what language is about. That's not what it's for. That's not how it develops. It couldn't possibly be the case. Now, it couldn't possibly be the case that our minds are so, you know, attuned to, say, quantum theory, that the terms that enter into a child's lexicon are the quantum theoretic terms for the constituents of the universe. And obviously that's not true. There are no natural kind terms in natural language, at least if natural kinds are the kinds of nature. Well, let's see. What I want to turn to, let me just summarize this. I don't think there's any, the real world component of reference is an interesting question. You know, it's an interesting question to try to figure out whether indeed is a real world component that enters into reference. But the arguments that are given for it, which are all variations of this, I mean, this is the key argument, and there are many variations, just don't seem to show anything. They start with an illegitimate import of intuitions from the natural word referring to the technical word refer, which means what you say it means. And having made that illegitimate move, you quickly enter into paradox. as happens constantly when you make illegitimate moves. I'll give some other cases as we proceed. But though this is an appealing idea, it just doesn't seem sustainable. There seems no reason to believe that real-world factors enter into either reference in the sense of what people refer to, or meaning in the sense of what fixes what they refer to. So though an interesting idea, it doesn't seem to apply to natural language or to psychology in general. If that's the case, then the externalist program is without value. It's sort of intellectually interesting, but essentially without value. That's another controversial conclusion, and therefore you ought to think about it, because it's totally dominant in analytic philosophy, virtually without any question, though unsustainable in my opinion. Well, what I want to get to next is a tradition that starts with Frege and comes up till today, that provides a different approach, a different kind of, in a way, more fundamental reason for believing in common language and reference in this sense and so on. But I think maybe I start with that this afternoon. You want this?
Can you put that on your belt?
Oh. Oh, I see. So just hang it here?
You notice that the notion of reference is an artifact, that there is no place for this notion.
Well, I haven't yet said that. I will say that later. But so far all I've said is it's a technical concept.
Naturalistic.
Well, I don't think so, but I haven't said that yet. So what I've said so far is that it's a technical concept, like undecidability.
You said that we have no intuitions about
I have no intuitions about it, yeah.
Let's start from this one. Well, but do you think that we don't have intuitions about naming, about speaking of
Oh, sure.
something?
Yeah, we have intuitions about referring also. For example, my intuitions tell me that it makes perfect sense to say John was referring to London when he complained about the traffic. At least my intuition says that could perfectly well be true. That's the way I understand the word referring. So I certainly have intuitions about referring. And I understand that when I say, you know, John named his child Oscar. So I have intuitions about naming. But those are not the technical terms, refer and name. Those are words of natural language which happen to sound like the technical terms, refer and name. Similarly, you know, we can have intuitions about the English language word undecidability, but we better not carry those intuitions, whatever they may be, over to the study of undecidability in metamathematics. If we do, we'll be in trouble.
And couldn't the notion of reference be a theoretical term, a notion which help us to explain this?
Yeah, it could.
intuition?
It could. That's the next question. That's why I want to make a distinction. I haven't yet. I will come back to that and say it doesn't help us, but it could, sure. The question, see, if we've agreed that it's a technical term, then we agree first we have no intuitions about it, and then we open exactly the question that you raised. Given that it's a technical notion, is it a useful one? Some technical notions are great, you know, other ones are no good. Is this one any good? So that's the next question.
A different question. It seemed to me that you said that the notion of white content is contrary to naturalism in this diagram. Well, that outside the world that's talking in these terms should be by definition naturalistic notion, because natural kinds are there outside, and natural also things like trees and so on.
Well, remember the special way I defined it naturalistic. I defined naturalistic. Maybe I should have repeated that. But I started at the beginning by saying there's an approach to the world in the manner of the sciences, okay, which I suggest carries no burden of proof. If you're following that approach, you just do it. You don't have to justify yourself. And I said, let's call that approach naturalistic, meaning it approaches things in the manner of the sciences. I'm not calling it scientific, because sometimes the naturalistic approach doesn't get very far. Scientific is kind of an honorific term. You know, to say that something's scientific is to say it's good. You know, it really got somewhere. I mean, and I want to abstract away from whether it got there, it got anywhere. So I don't want to discuss the question, say whether linguistics is really scientific, like has it really achieved enough so that we can give it this honorific term, but rather just want to discuss whether it's following the methods of the sciences, and that's what I meant by naturalistic. Now, this notion is not, you don't arrive at this notion by following the methods of the sciences, because this notion arises only in the study of everything. And part of the methods of the sciences is you don't study everything. You know, if you're ever at a point where the next question requires that everything is equally relevant, you know you've made a mistake. That's like what happened, you know, why do things happen? It's exactly why do things happen is not a question of the sciences. I mean, it's a question about the world, I guess. But it's not a question of the sciences, and it wouldn't arise in naturalistic inquiry in this sense.
First of all, I would like to express, to clarify my views. I used today's other word, sociolinguistics, but it was only to focus your attention to another area. Actually, I was not playing the sociolinguistic role. I was aiming at another problem, and I think that I got your answer yesterday through the example of the elm and the beech tree. In the sense that what I think it's necessary, it is a cross-fertilization of concepts across the boundaries of languages.
Sorry, I didn't understand. Actually, I wasn't thinking of your comment when I discussed this, but say it again? I didn't follow, I'm afraid.
The idea that when developing philosophical language, I think that sometimes to insist too much on the concept of mind in English is misleading when there are other even languages of the same culture that have
I see. So to use the concept, maybe we shouldn't take the concept mind and carry it over to a better theory. I agree with that. That's true, in fact, of every concept of natural language. Again, except by the sheerest accident, which we can forget about, no concept of natural language is going to carry over to rational inquiry, including mind. I mean, mind, I think we should just use as a descriptive term to refer to a particular range of problems, like problems about thinking, about intentionality, about speaking, referring, all that kind of stuff, perceiving. I mean, those are all questions of mind, but it's just a kind of a loose descriptive category. I agree with you. We shouldn't.
Coming to this problem, very famous problem of the document
Of
reference and sense and reference.
sense and reference, yeah.
But I think that so this is a very good example. It's a very fruitful area. And I think that the more we think and the more we discuss about this, the better. Because, for instance, I don't think that the reference of water can be H2O. It is a reference to an analysis of water, a certain analysis. So there are when Frege developed the concept of Bedeutung and Sinn, it was mainly in the relation of geometry. I mean, although then he used examples of the morning sun and the morning star ring, which is the rising star. But the real origin of that was how you could get to a point in the triangle, etc., and define it in different ways.
Yeah.
And I think this is a misleading origin because we have layers of interpretation. And for instance, the analysis of H2O is good at this moment for a certain purpose, but even scientists can be using another description, another layer of reference. And of course, these layers of reference are different from theirs in everyday life. And so reference is not bound to only one point. It's polyreferential. It has many references for different usage, and even in scientific terms. So I do not agree at all with the idea that H2O is the final reference. This is an analysis, temporary degree of analysis. And to go back to a very famous example of Wittgenstein, this is more or less the example of the broom. I mean, the broom. You can divide the broom into two parts, but sometimes it is irrelevant, it is useless, it is stupid to speak about the parts of the broom, the components of the broom. I think that here we have a very interesting game of reference and state, and they interact all the time.
Well, let me be a devil's advocate and play Putnam at the moment. Putnam would agree with you that the reference of water may turn out not to be H2O. In fact, it already isn't, because it's been discovered to be a mixture of H2O and D2O. Okay, and maybe tomorrow it'll be discovered to be something else. But he says the reference of water is something, and it is what the ultimate science will discover it is. So there's a real reference of water, namely the essence. The idea that he has is this, that our concepts, and it's not a crazy idea, I think there's some truth to it, our concepts of things like water and so on are based on the notion same. And the notion same refers to the essence. Okay, so he says when I refer to water, that the word water refers to the essence of whatever is the same as that. Okay, that's the idea. And when the word tiger refers to the essence of whatever is the same as that, and I point to something in a zoo. So in the whole, he has a complicated story of fixing meaning. It's a very interesting article, this first one, Meaning of Meaning, and other stuff that has come from it. And his idea is that meaning is kind of like a vector. It has a lot of different points in it. One of the points is picking out some specific thing, kind of like a paradigm example. So maybe it's that glass, the stuff in that glass, or maybe it's the guy walking around in a cage in the zoo. And your word tiger is based on the concept same, really, same liquid, you know, same animal, and so on. And what makes something the same animal is a matter of essences, and essences are discovered by science. So at one point it might have been thought that the essence of being a tiger, you know, being the same as that thing over there, which is a tiger, it might have been thought that the essence is, you know, something about, I don't know, the shape or the color or something. And now it's thought that the essence of tiger is the DNA constitution. And maybe later it'll be thought to be something else. But what the word water or tiger or any natural kind term refers to is the essential features of something, of whatever is like some paradigm example. That's his theory. Now, I don't think one can say that that can't be true, because we can stipulate it to be true. We can construct a symbolic system, call it the language of science if you like, in which we stipulate that this holds. We stipulate that the words of this symbolic system, like water and tiger, work in the following fashion. They pick out the inner essence of whatever identifies this class of things. We stipulate that so it can't be wrong. You know. Of course, that thing isn't a language any longer. It's a symbolic system of science. And in that system, this may be a perfectly reasonable move to make. With regard to Frege, I think, if I understood you correctly, I think you're exactly right. Frege was really interested in the sum of 2 plus 3, you know, not in the moon, you know, the morning star and the evening star. And as long as he's talking about the sum of 2 plus 3, the terms he introduces make perfect sense. When he's talking about the morning star and the evening star, he's introducing notions which may not apply to natural language. You can, in other words, in short, you can stipulate symbolic systems in which words refer. You can create a notion reference. You know, you can invent a notion reference, which is technical, like undecidability is technical in metamathematics. And you give it what properties you want, and you say, okay, it's a relation between words and things, but the real things Okay, it's a relation between words and things, but whatever the real things are. That is the essential entities of nature, you know. That's what the words refer to. And we often don't know, and in fact maybe we always don't know. But that's what they refer to anyhow because I stipulate it. And maybe that's a goal for the language of science, that it should be based on notions like sameness, you know. Possible. In fact, I think yes. I mean, I think it's a reasonable goal for the language of science. It has nothing to do with ordinary language.
How is the distinction between social factors and the real world factors meant? Is it meant as a sharp distinction? Because it's strange, isn't it?
Yeah. Maybe I didn't pick the best terms, but what is intended is a sharp distinction. The social factors have to do with the interaction of people in communities. Okay. The real world factors have to do with the essence of things. Okay, so what I mean by real world factors is what I just mentioned in case of Putnam. The essence of things determines what the word refers to. So if you take the word Aristotle, say, what it really refers to is the essential nature of the thing. Aristotle. We may be wrong in all our beliefs.
In the case of Aristotle, but what happened to the room?
With room? Broom. Well, that's the problem. Yeah, that's the problem that arises with artifacts. See, and in fact, Kripke, in his early discussion of this in Naming and Necessity, he does discuss artifacts. He discusses a table, I think, and he says, if this thing is a table, it is necessarily a table. That is, it's the essence of this thing to be a table. It's an essential feature of it that it is a table. And he does say that. I think it's totally wrong. But it sort of comes out of his way of looking at things. So artifacts also have an essence. In my opinion, Aristotle had a better idea there, namely that having a certain function is a factor that enters into the meaning of things, or the nature of things, as he put it. Having a certain function enters into the nature of things. Like being a table is one of the functions of this thing, and that enters into its nature. Now, if we take that view and we divorce it from the metaphysics, which doesn't make any sense, and we make it epistemological, we take the whole Aristotelian view and transfer it up to the mind. So instead of the world being divided into these various qualities and so on, we say, well, that's what our minds are like, and our minds impose that structure on the world. And then it all quickly makes sense. It's perfectly true, I think, that we characterize objects in terms of their constitution, their function, and so on and so forth. But that tells us nothing about the essence of things. I mean, this thing is what it is. If we happen to use it for a table, it's a table. If somebody else uses it as a bed, it's a bed. Somebody else uses it as a key, it's a key. If some Martian divides things into the world on the basis of whether they're nailed to the floor or not, that's his categorization. If it's nailed to the floor, it goes into one category. If it's not nailed to the floor, it goes to another category. Then for the Martian, this is essentially something not nailed to the floor and accidentally a table. And if it was nailed to the floor, it would shift essences. But of course, what the thing is doesn't depend on whether I'm thinking about it or the Martian's thinking about it.
And even the essence may change because of social factors.
Well, not the, they would, so the externalist would claim, but I don't think so. It seems,
but
according to that view, yeah, the essence would change on the basis of social factors. In fact, this has led to contemporary philosophical essentialism, which is a big field that came out of this, is trying to find the essential nature of things. And in my opinion, it's constantly leading to paradox, like the idea that this really is a table, not a thing not nailed to the floor, because I'm looking at it, not a Martian. How can that affect what this is? Or take a case from one of the most recent articles I've seen, at least, in the journal Philosophy by Joseph Almog, who's a very good young philosopher. And it's about a journal Philosophy. It's a couple of months ago. It's about essentialism, which is a big topic. And he starts off by taking as an example some mountain. I forget what it was. So whatever the mountain is, he picked a real one. And he wants to sort of tease out your intuitions about this and then, draw some big philosophical conclusions. And he argues, of course, that mountain is essentially a mountain. It couldn't be anything else and still be the same thing. It couldn't be anything other than a mountain and still be the same thing. So I don't know about your intuitions, but mine are quite different. So here's this object, on the Earth's surface. And he says that thing, that very thing, must be a mountain because of necessity it is a mountain. It sort of follows from the general framework. At least my intuition is that if the water level rises up to this point, then this thing is an island. It's not a mountain. And it's still the same thing. In fact, islands are mountains. It's just that most of them is underwater. Or if you dump Earth around this thing up to, say, a millimeter away or something less than is perceptible, but you leave a little minuscule space in there below the level of perception, then you haven't changed the thing, at least in my intuition. It's the same thing it was before, but now it's part of a plateau. And so on for a million other things. I mean, I don't have any of those intuitions. My intuitions are quite different. So at least if we're doing folk psychology, which is what we're supposed to be doing, it just seems to me people are being radically misled. And there's nothing here about the essence of things. I mean, it's what it is. If I call it a mountain, it's because of its relationships for me between, its height and some other low thing. But that doesn't make it essentially a mountain. That's a way of viewing the world. There's a way of viewing the world which comes out of the human mind, which makes that thing now a mountain, but doesn't tell you anything about its essence. In fact, I don't think there are no essences. Things are just what they are. I mean, every property is as essential as every other property, or as accidental as every other property. The talk about essences, I think, is a mistake that comes from taking our mental categories and introducing them into the world. And they're not in the world, they're in our minds, they're in our ways of conceiving the world. I think, in fact, if you take Aristotle's whole corpus and you rephrase it from metaphysical to epistemological, it makes a lot of sense. The levels of reality and all this kind of stuff. If you forget the idea that those are the constituents of nature, and if you say eliminate the idea that science proceeds by moving up through the parts of nature, and you say, well, look, that's the way our minds work when we look at things, it makes a fair amount of sense.
This vision of essence would be very much Wittgensteinian, wouldn't it?
Kind of, yeah. I would say, well, except that Wittgenstein, it's a little, not quite, I think, because Wittgenstein always says he's stopping before explanation. He doesn't want to give an explanation of anything. He just wants to give enough of a description, an accurate enough description, so that you don't enter into error. And this is going beyond into explanation. Maybe, right or wrong.
I mean, when he says that the essence lies in language.
Yeah, I think it lies in thought, actually. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's consistent at least.
In your book, Rules and Representations, I think you said that there may be two separate but interacting systems. The system of computational rules and a perceptual system, which links to the linguistic system that is also involved in nonverbal mental acts and processes.
Yeah, I think that's right. Well, I mean, what I suggested there, is that, if you look at the the whole architecture of the mind-brain, there are going to be a lot of different components. And undoubtedly, everything that we're saying is much too crude. If more is learned, they'll be much more refined. But there is a language faculty which just seems different from a conceptual faculty. So it seems to have different properties. They certainly interact. I mean, in fact, they interact right at the lexicon. The lexicon is probably the point of interaction between the conceptual faculties and the language faculty. And in fact, it's a very hard question to decide what in the lexicon belongs to the language side and what in the lexicon belongs to the belief side. That's a question which is relevant to meaning holism, in fact. Like Quine says, the whole business belongs to the belief side. There's nothing on the lexical side, which can't be right, I don't think. But the problem of determining what in our linguistic expressions is brought over from our system of beliefs and what in our linguistic expressions come from the language faculty is a hard question to answer, which means we don't have the tools to answer it. They're dissociated, and we don't have the experimental tools or whatever, at the moment at least, to make that distinction. We can do it in some cases, but not in others. By now, there's empirical evidence to distinguish these two, and in fact, several other categories. If you're interested, there's a book. One of the best studies of this that I know is a book by a woman named Yamada, I think, called Laura, where there's a particularly interesting introduction by John Marshall, this neurophysiologist I mentioned yesterday, who reviews a lot of evidence on this story. Laura was a girl who had, I think, very high language capacity, but virtually no intelligence. Couldn't think, couldn't find her way around, had no measurable intelligence, but her language was quite good. And there are other people there are other cases of people who have very high intelligence, but have lost their language capacity, or never had a language capacity, in fact, some of the cases that are now around are quite astonishing. I mentioned to somebody, there's a case recently studied by Neil Smith, linguist at Oxford, of a guy who also has no measurable intelligence, can't do anything, but he can translate simultaneously from 16 languages perfectly, These people he doesn't know what he's translating because he doesn't understand anything, but he gives perfect translations from Greek, Turkish, just picks them up like this. It's kind of an idiot savant type case, but there are a lot of such cases, and the point is that these capacities appear to be dissociated. They can be dissociated, which is good evidence that they're separate capacities, of course. And there's by now a lot of such cases of different kinds. In fact, the linguists who are working with this 16 language guy are looking into questions like, in his Italian, for example, he knows Italian. Does he really get all the crazy details about where pro can appear and all this kind of stuff? And it turns out he knows virtually everything. I mean, you have to go very far to find things that he gets wrong. Although he doesn't understand a word and can't get around in the world and can't do anything and he can't solve problems and so on. So it appears that he's just lost his conceptual capacities but maintained his linguistic, in fact, has an unusual linguistic faculty.
About language skills, for example, in the contextual there is nevertheless a kind of interaction sometimes, let's say, we can say, for example, causation and cognitive construction, which is being studied, Carl Chomsky studies that way. And since that children acquire, causation, I think, is very difficult for children to acquire the construct level.
No, not really.
Level,
I mean, there's old...
Because structures are definitely...
Well, there's all this old work going back to Michat, which I think still holds up, back 40 years ago, that shows that very young children appear to have a concept of causality. That is, at least under some cases. He studied, these are pre-linguistic children. You study, like you see a line coming along, a billiard ball, say, coming along and hitting another one. And I forget how the experiments were set up, but they were set up in such a way as to see whether the kids could understand that the first one hitting the second one caused it to move. And they were clever experiments. I haven't looked at them for years, and I forgot them. There's another guy named Johansson, who back in the 1950s did more work on this, and seemed to be showing that pre-linguistic children had a well-established concept of causality.
Okay, so the difficulty would be more kind of linguistic maybe for children to get
The notion of causatives?
Because when mothers have questions and using causative constructions, they have trouble with that.
They have trouble understanding them. Well, you know, the relation between causative constructions and causation is not direct, you know. There are plenty of causative constructions that don't have anything to do with cause. They have to do with other things. And you don't, if I didn't know that that was true, but if it is true, then there could be a lot of reasons. I mean, causative constructions have certain complexities. You know, they have a lot of complex features, and maybe they haven't yet developed those complexities. But the conceptual development seems to go well before any use of language. I mean, there's a lot of mythology about this. For example, say Quine in Word and Object argues kind of a priori that your concept of object, you know, stable object, only arises from the use of language at the point where language has inflections like plural and stuff like that. Then you get a concept object. But it's well known that you get notions like, you know, that kids have object constancy, you know, when they're, I don't know, 8 months old or something like that. Meaning, so for example, if you, a young infant will be surprised if there's an object over here going behind and it goes behind a screen, so you can't see it. It's moving along at a steady speed. It's going behind a screen. It's supposed to emerge over here. But if it emerges over here, the kid will get startled. You know? And that's for very young babies. You just measure, it's so young that the only way they're measuring anything is by sucking rate. There's a lot of stuff like that. There's a woman named Elizabeth Spelke who's done some really good work on this, trying to determine what features enter into identifying something as an object. Turns out that one of the most striking features is what in the Gestalt literature was called common fate. Namely, the several parts of the thing undergo the same history. Even so even if the thing is separated, you know, like if you have two balls, a child will regard it as an object if everything that happens to the top ball also happens to the bottom ball. You know? Like it's as if they imagine, well, there must be a rigid, invisible rod between them or something. And this is way pre-linguistic. You know? In fact, as I say, the experiments are done mostly with measuring sucking rate and things like that. So it seems that there are all kinds of, you know, rich concepts available before you're using them. And it may well be, as Jerry Fodor has argued, that picking a word in the lexicon is just taking one of the already available concepts and attaching a label to it. And that's the extreme view. Thanks.
What you mentioned about Jerry Fodor at the end, is it possible that a child will attach a word to a concept because he's learned it from his mother? In which case, it goes back to what this gentleman was saying before. Perhaps there is some kind of inhibition or command that says stop until first words are formed, mother, father, and immediately it seems that there is a social network being built.
Well, it's very likely true that a social network is required for language acquisition, but a social network is needed for physical growth. You know, I think I mentioned in discussion or something that children simply do not grow properly unless they have the right interactions. It's the standard thing with institutionalized children. If you look at institutionalized children, they're getting all the, you know, it may be a good institution, so like maybe they're getting the right food and, you know, sleeping enough and everything else, but they're often stunted, physically stunted. I think I mentioned the study of depth perception of lambs. Lambs do not develop proper depth perception if they're deprived of mother neonate contact. Now, obviously, the mother's not teaching them to see depth, you know, but something about the interaction is getting the systems going. And surely the same would be true of language. When you talk about learning words or concepts, you have to be rather careful because remember that words, what we call words, you know, fixing a sound and a meaning, putting them together, is done virtually on a single presentation. See, that's the point that has impressed Jerry Fodor when he argues that all the words are there in your head and all you're doing is attaching a sound to them. If you take a look at the rate of acquisition of words, you know, how fast kids acquire words, there are periods of life, like, you know, around 3 or 4, when kids are acquiring 12 words a day. Now, that must mean that they're learning the word on maybe one presentation and somehow getting the whole rich structure of the word. If you try to define a word properly, it's got a very rich, complex structure. Things like the Oxford English Dictionary don't even come close. You know, I mean, the things we call dictionaries, the biggest one there is, you know, is just a collection of hints which some human being who already knows everything can use to guess what they're talking about. Just as the things we call grammars, even, you know, 20-volume grammar, is just hints which somebody who is human can look at and say, oh, it must go this way. The discovery that these were only hints is quite recent. I mean, until fairly recently, it was thought that grammars really described languages and that dictionaries really described words, and they don't. They just hint at what they are. And that's related to the fact, which again suggests you really know all the answers. You just don't know exactly how to associate things. Well, in the case of acquisition of vocabulary, it's extremely striking. Now, if a child is acquiring words on one presentation, you know, it makes no sense to say the mother's teaching it. You can't be teaching the rich complexity of a word by just using it once. And that's the way kids pick words up. They hear it used once, and they know the meaning. I mean, sometimes not, you know, not entirely. It's got to be refined a little, but it's quite an astonishing phenomenon, and it's very hard to explain except on the basis of a hypothesis that Jerry Fodor again put forth, which just everybody finds extremely shocking, but it's hard to get around, and that is that words are innate. Innate. They're in the head. You know, they're in the body, in the genes. The words are in the genes, basically. And all you're learning is something pretty trivial, what the sound meaning is, which sound goes with them.
And 2 other quick questions that crossed my mind during the discussion this morning. That you mentioned in talking about a naturalistic approach to discovering whether it's externalist theories are valid or internalist theories are valid. You said something to the effect that if there are 2 equally explanatory theories, the biological one will always
win over the sociological one. Yeah.
The other question, and I have a tendency to be a little skeptical of that for various historical reasons. For example, multiple sclerosis doesn't have a satisfactory biological explanation.
Right.
Another thing is when you use the concepts, the terms to legitimize the